back a little bit. Just be careful if you see anything flying at him.
Yeah, you got it.
2 o'clock East Coast time, and this is the scene not terribly far from the White House and not terribly far from the reviewing stand and what will be the end of the parade route. Certainly a lot closer than where the gathering is right now across town at the Capitol. Official Washington is inside the luncheon behind closed doors.
Hey, guys, can you hear me okay?
This is happening in the business district of Washington.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay?
You're listening to our correspondent, Jacob Rascone.
This is mine. Hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3.
Are we still overmodulated?
I can't hear anybody talking back to me.
Jacob, it's Brian. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry.
We're still having those audio issues. In terms of what I was just describing about San Francisco, what we're told now in terms of what's going on in San Francisco is that San Francisco police say there have been at least 50 arrests there. That's in connection with several Inauguration Day protests going on around that city. There was expected to be a rather large-scale protest in Los Angeles as well as a school walkout. That appears to not have had a huge turnout, and possibly in part because of heavy rain in L.A. But there are a lot of people out in the streets of San Francisco and 50 arrests, and this is the scene right this second in Washington.
Jacob, let's try this again. It's Brian. Can you hear me?
Brian, hi. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we have a police line. Obviously, they have their riot shields, and they're protecting against the rocks that are being thrown by the protesters. This has been going on for about a half hour, where the police are spraying pepper spray. They're also throwing the flashbangs, which are very loud. You might have heard some of those earlier. To be clear, there were many hundreds of protesters earlier, but now those that are actually actively fighting against the police, there are only several dozen of them. Most of those who were here earlier blocking checkpoints, all the groups converged into one. Those groups have left, and now we have mostly those protesters who are dressed in black, their faces are covered. When I talk to them and ask who they are, they don't want to talk to me. They don't want to tell me who they are. They want to be identified. So you're seeing now as they drag these trash cans away, or these are not trash cans, I apologize, these are newspaper stands, but they were earlier dragging trash cans in chairs and tables and then these stands out into the street. They were also smashing windows. This was going on right before President Trump took the oath, and then it stopped for a couple of hours. The police had everybody cornered and surrounded, and it was quiet, but then suddenly in the last 30 minutes or so, I believe a group of protesters, it looked like, was pushing up against the police line. They started to push back, and now we have what we're seeing now.
All right, Jacob, obviously stay with it, and we'll stay with you. Protesters appear to be, as Jacob said, establishing their own line.
And Brian, if I could, there have been, we've heard from D.C. police, there were several arrests earlier, and there were also a few police officers who were hurt because the rock throwing was also going on before the swearing in. There are also several protesters who were hurt. At least one of them was bleeding from the head and was carried off in a stretcher. Most of the other protesters I've seen who look injured, it looks like they were just pepper sprayed in the face and they were carried off by some of their friends. So there were officers who were injured, I think, by rocks, it looked like. We've seen them throwing rocks and bricks on and off for the past half hour, and then before that, before the swearing in. It just escalated quickly when the lines were pushing up against each other.
Jacob, thanks. For the control room, let's get a map of the district up on the screen, please, so we can show this area in relation to where the luncheon's going on at the Capitol, in relation to where the motorcade will be coming. I suspect this is going to get much more serious, and police are going to get more determined about clearing this as the motorcade comes down their way. And I'm speaking generally about the area of town.
This is what's going on. So it is K Street between 12th and 13th. It's actually the Washington Post is on K Street between 13th and 14th. So if Jacob actually needs a place to duck into,
yep.
I would recommend going into the Post if he needs to. And you're absolutely right, Brian, because you know, it is the Capitol would be essentially at block 0. So it's 12 long blocks that way, but also considerably north of where a straight line from the Capitol heading west would be. But the parade route is up Pennsylvania Avenue. It brings it closer to where the disturbances are taking. Again, probably not any closer than 6 blocks or so, but that would be close enough for the police to want to end this, I think.
And we should be clear that the security presence in Washington is nothing short of massive. I mean, Washington is a very heavily defended city, and there's a big law enforcement presence on compared to other American cities on an average Friday. But on a day like this, with an occasion like this, there are physical barriers everywhere. There are crowd control strategies everywhere. There are many tens of thousands of officers out there. But these confrontations, this physical fight between this small group of protesters and these police officers, this is what nobody wanted to see, and this will not. This is something that it will be hard to imagine this ending any way other than in a mass arrest situation. I mean, we'll see how the D.C. police handle this, but
D.C. police certainly used to be absolutely state-of-the-art in terms of crowd control. They frankly haven't had a lot of occasion to practice this sort of thing recently, but they're still quite good at this.
I have just the person to ask about security in Washington. Our veteran justice correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete, what can you add to these pictures we're seeing?
Well, as the number you had just on the bottom of the screen, the D.C. police say they arrested 95 people. What they describe as violent protest, which means protesters doing damage, started in an area called Franklin Square, which is about 6 blocks north of the parade route. This is K Street, and I think it's safe to say that anybody going down Pennsylvania Avenue in the inaugural parade wouldn't see or hear any of this. It's a good distance away, and there's all those people lining the parade route, which would sort of buffer the sound. So I don't think that they would be aware of this, but the police chief, the acting police chief here, says that the arrests followed a number of broken windows in 4 or 5 businesses. There's a Starbucks, an Au Bon Pain, a hotel called the Crown Plaza, the window outside an ATM at a bank. And after those things happened, that's when the police started making arrests. And the police chief has been stressing here in the last hour or so that the number of people disobeying police instructions, not protesting peacefully, is very small compared to the total number of people who came to demonstrate here today. One person was arrested last night at a pro-Trump event not far from where you're looking at now at the National Press Building, which is on 13th Street. This is in the area of 13th and 14th Streets. And 12th Street. So that's where this is happening. K Street's the main sort of business thoroughfare in the district. Washington, D.C. is partly government and partly commercial, and K Street's more or less the commercial thing. Now it looks like the police are deploying some irritant gas to move people away, and they seem to be moving away because of that.
Yeah, they're getting serious, Pete. As you were talking, our camera was over at the left of this police line. You can still see the spray there, spraying a huge amount of something like pepper spray, an irritant, a dispersant as a result. And as we predicted, they're getting much more serious about this. We're also hearing many more of those flashbang grenades. And Pete, tell the folks how many different jurisdictions we've got in uniform in Washington.
Well, for Inauguration weekend, we have to add to the usual number. Metropolitan Police are in charge of the streets. Secret Service is in charge of protecting the inaugural events. but this is strictly Metro PD. That's what the D.C. Police Department is called. And they can also bring in National Guard troops who are on standby here. There's about 5,000 or 6,000 National Guard troops that can be deployed if needed. D.C. police have dealt with things like this in the past. The World Bank protests got out of hand a couple of years ago. So they often deal with protests that become violent like this, and they're well equipped to do it. But we've got, of course, the Secret Service, the FBI, the ATF, the Marshal Service. All those federal agents are really not involved in what you're looking at here. This is really keeping the peace in the streets, and that's pretty much the sole responsibility of the Washington, D.C. Police Department. But they can call on others if things get out of hand.
It's a unique city. They used to talk about in front of the White House, you could step from Secret Service jurisdiction onto National Park Service jurisdiction, and once you made it to the curb, you would be in Metropolitan Police jurisdiction. But those three uniformed police services, as is the case throughout Washington, working side by side with overlapping, in some cases, jurisdiction. We're in a situation here where you have the helmeted and riot-shielded police officers. This is MPD, Metropolitan Police Department, the local police department in Washington. And then across from them are this combination of protesters and members of the media, still and video. And then a lot of people, many of them protesters, scrambling. As Jacob said, there are protesters and there are protesters. There are folks who've been throwing things and doing damage, and there are folks who are affiliated, and then there are kind of hangers-on. So this is kind of typical at protests. What's not typical is a very aggressive response with crowd chemical dispersants and flashbang grenades, because they really don't want to fool around today and let something get larger than their ability to control it. Not in this piece of real estate, not in this city, not on Inauguration Day when the eyes of the world are on that parade route.
We have had protesters at inaugural parades in the past. George W. Bush, after the Bush v. Gore 2000 election, there were a number of protests along the parade route that year. What's interesting and different about actually, let's go to back to Pete Williams. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that several of these groups, violent protest groups, had said in advance they wanted to, quote, shut the city down before the inauguration, try to affect the inauguration. The effect on people getting into the secure areas, and remember this, what we're looking at here, where they're pushing people back away from, in essence, further north away from the parade route. This is well away from the secure area where you have to go through metal detectors to get into the zone to either watch the parade or be on the National Mall to the south of Pennsylvania Avenue. There were some scattered protests this morning at some of those checkpoints where people who have tickets to get into the place where you could either sit down or stand near the inauguration, they tried to shut some of those checkpoints down and successfully did for about 45 minutes, one of them, and there were sort of moments where a couple of the checkpoints were hard to get to, but for the most part, if you are attending the inauguration, you're well away from this, you're probably unaware that this is going on.
That was a very efficient move while you were talking, Pete. They just cleared all the real estate in that intersection very easily and very quickly.
Yeah. What's unusual about this inauguration is not that there are protests, but that such large protests and so many protesters are expected, even just for permitted events, and some of those are today, but a huge number of people are expected for a big peaceful protest tomorrow. They're expecting 200,000 people for that Women's March. A lot of those people are in D.C. already, having violent confrontations, and as Pete said, 95 arrests so far, having police officers injured, having property damage today will cast some sort of shadow will set some sort of tone in terms of the policing and in terms of the turnout for subsequent protests. And that's just a fact of how these things go. So the police will be on a different footing because of what's happening today than they would have otherwise been towards what are expected to be very, very, very large protests in the next 24 hours.
And I know a lot of people are going to be in that protest tomorrow, and they're not people like the people here with the masks on, I can tell you. They're not out for trouble. I am impressed by the defensive phalanx of the police. They're not chasing after particular hecklers or people that are taunting them with stones. They're not racing after them in an aggressive way. They are holding the line here. And obviously they've been told that that's the position they should be taking, a restrained, very restrained, at least what we've seen, position by the police here. They don't want to have any more violence than is absolutely necessary here.
At two ends of town in Washington, D.C., for our viewers just joining us, 2:15 Eastern, we're covering two very, very different things on two fronts. And one is a closed-door, very nice luncheon with the congressional leadership and the new president, members of the new cabinet. The other is this. In a short period of time, the new president is going to climb into a motorcade that will form the start of the inaugural parade, making his way right where you see, from the Capitol down to the White House. So this is why police are taking such an aggressive stance to get these protests put down and at least under control. We are going to take our first break, and we do so reminding you on the other side, we'll get the inaugural parade underway. It is widely believed that the new president, Donald Trump, will dismount from the motorcade and walk at least part of the journey. A lot ahead when we continue.